Hello, I'm Mark Christ. I'm the head of adult programming for the Central Arkansas Library System, and I'm also a Civil War historian. I've written and edited several books on the Civil War in Arkansas, and today I'm going to be talking about the October 25, 1863 Battle of Pine Bluff, which was the last battle of any size that occurred in Arkansas in 1863. So on September 10, 1863, this man pictured here, General Frederick Steele, led a Union army that captured Little Rock. Effectively, between the capture of Little Rock and the capture of Fort Smith 9 days earlier, the Union Army now held tenuous control of the entire Arkansas River Valley. So on not long after the fall of the Capitol, a federal officer wrote that immediately a deputation of citizens were sent from Pine Bluff to request General Steele to occupy Pine Bluff with his forces, to prevent the destruction of property and the conscription of unwilling citizens into the Confederate Army. Steele dispatched part of the 5th Kansas Cavalry. All able-bodied men are ordered on 3-day scout. August Bondy of the 5th Kansas reported on September 14. And this man, William Kreitz, reported that the regiment took possession of the place without meeting with the slightest resistance. The citizens generally gave our soldiers a friendly reception, throwing open their larders and inviting them to partake of the best their larders contained. 3 days later, Bondy rode all the balance of the regiment for Pine Bluff, and they were soon joined by their brigade mates, the 1st Indiana Cavalry. Well, one woman remembered that, quote, the Yankees arrived with flashing sabers and big oaths. Another sniffed that they have not forced anyone to take the oath, though other numbers have done so voluntarily. There are more Union people here and in Little Rock than anyone ever thought. So for the next month or so, this little band of around 550 horsemen from Kansas and Indiana would hold the line of the Arkansas at Pine Bluff. Well, the rough and tumble attitude of the Kansans did not endear them to the citizens of Pine Bluff. Mrs. Arabella Langtry Wilson wrote that the men of the 5th, quote, were going around stealing horses, hunting up firearms, and taking everything they thought proper. After a few weeks, however, the men fell into the routine of garrison life, leading Captain Youngs of the 5th Kansas to amuse to his brother, don't know what the 5th will do for excitement. Guess we will take to the Union girls of the county. They are affectionate in the extreme, feast us on buttermilk and corn dodgers, which, by the way, is the climax of Arkansas hospitality. The Union regiment at Pine Bluff was under the command of Howell Clayton, who would later become Arkansas's Reconstruction governor. One trooper of the 5th Kansas wrote, he is considered the best cavalry officer in this latitude. And a secessionist Pine Bluff woman allowed that Clayton, quote, is a very gentlemanly man, and by his humane and obliging manners has quite won the people. John Newman Edwards of J.O. Shelby's command wrote that, quote, Colonel Clayton was an officer of activity and enterprise, clear-headed, quick to conceive, and bold and rapid to execute. His success in the field has caused him to be considered the ablest federal commander of cavalry west of the Mississippi. Well, Pine Bluff also had a large number of refugee former slaves housed in contraband camps. One of them, Boston Blackwell, interviewed by the WPA during the Great Depression, said that he and a fellow slave had fled from their plantation after their owner threatened them with whipping. It was cold, frosty weather, Blackwell remembered. When we got to the Yankee camp, all our troubles was over. We got all the contraband we could eat. The Yankee feeds all the refugees on contraband. Mary Harris, another Jefferson County slave, recalled that, I remember the Yankee soldiers come and took the colored folk away if they wanted to go. They carried us to the county band and fed us. Arabella Langtry Wilson noted that, quote, noted the stampede of fleeing slaves, writing that for 30 miles around, they come pouring in by the hundreds. Everyone's servant ran off to Pine Bluff. There is scarcely a house that has a servant left. Well, the Confederates soon began scouting out the Union positions at Pine Bluff in preparation for a possible attack. Texan Buck wrote that he said, "Sending 2 of my men as countrymen hauling wood. They went, acted well as their part, got what information I wanted, and reported to me, which consisted of the number of cannon, where planted, the number of troops, and where camped, where headquarters were, etc. This information was sent by courier to General Marmaduke, who we see here. And young Benjamin Riggs of Pine Bluff made careful observations of Yankee positions in Pine Bluff before stealing away. The youth rode 60 miles to Princeton, avoiding both Union bands and Union patrols and bushwhacker bands, and presented himself to Colton Green, a Confederate general. Riggs wrote, "I explained everything I knew about the Federals in Pine Bluff, the number of troops, where the battery was parked. I told them what the place could be easily taken and surprised. I suspected they were aiming to attack Pine Bluff, though the general gave me no intimation." And in fact, Marmaduke was planning to attack. On October 24, he inspected his 2 divisions of cavalry, then set forth toward Pine Bluff, halting at the Saline River after a hard ride of 6 hours. As his men rested and their horses foraged, the rebel general gathered his commanders and issued orders. Marmaduke would continue up the Princeton Road with Colton Green's Missouri Division and J.C. Monroe's Arkansasiers, approaching Pine Bluff from the west. Colonel R.C. Newton, leading Major John Bull's Arkansas troopers, Major B.D. Chenoweth's Texas Brigade, and Major Robert C. Wood's battalion of Missourians, had split off at Cantrell Spring and attacked Pine Bluff from the southeast. The 2 columns would trap Clayton's small command within the city, and then crush them there or drive them into the Arkansas River. Well, on the morning of October 25, routine patrol, a company of the 5th Kansas under Lieutenant Milton F. Clark, was scouting toward Princeton. Clark had not moved much beyond the Yankee picket lines when, to their mutual surprise, the Kansans ran into the lead elements of Greene's column. The startled troops fired on each other, and Clark quickly positioned his men on either side of the road. An armed group of Confederates rode forward under a flag of truce, and as A.D. Brown of the 5th Kansas reported it, after relieving themselves of a surplus of gas and empty bravado, they informed the lieutenant that they were bearers of dispatches from Marmaduke. Clark chastised the Southerners for first firing on them before coming forth under a flag of truce, then requested 30 minutes to send men back to ask Clayton if he would accept the rebel delegation. The Confederates refused the request, implying that their dispatches included a surrender demand. Clark coolly replied that Colonel Clayton never surrenders, but is always anxious for you to come and take him, and you must get back to your command immediately, or I will order my men to fire on you. Skirmishing then began in earnest, and Marmaduke lost the essential element of his planned attack, which was, of course, surprise. Well, Clayton heard the sound of gunfire and assessed his command. He had the veteran 5th Kansas and 1st Indiana cavalry regiments, in addition to a small home guard company of around 50 men under the command of a Captain Murphy. He also had 6 mountain howitzers and 3 rifled steel cannon. But the businessmen of Pine Bluff had the town's warehouses bursting with heavy bales of cotton. And the Federals could also make use of the hundreds of contrabands from the camps around Pine Bluff. So Clayton ordered Captain James B. Talbot of the 1st Indiana to bring freedmen in to fortify the square. About 300 black men were soon rolling heavy cotton bales into position. Clayton reported, "In less than a half hour, I had all the streets leading into Court Square completely and very formidably fortified with cotton bales, and my artillery, 6 mountain howitzers and 3 small steel-rifled guns, planted as to command every street leading into the square. My sharpshooters posted in all the houses and other buildings on the square, so that the enemy could in no way approach the works only through the open spaces." Realizing that he would be in for a siege, Clayton sent 200 contraband to, quote, "commence carrying water from the river up to the square and fill all the barrels they could find, so that if necessary, I could hold out for 2 days." So there were 3 stages to this battle, and the first was a direct assault. On the Confederate left, Colonel J.C. Monroe soon encountered one of the contraband camps, which was, quote, taken possession of, containing tents, various articles of clothing, etc., with horses, mules, and wagons, also many Negroes. Skirmishes from the 5th Kansas opened up on the Missourians, but, quote, were hastily dislodged by our sharpshooters and steadily driven behind their cotton bale fortifications. Colonel G.W. Thompson reported. Monroe reported that his Arkansasiers steadily drove them back until within a short distance of their fortifications, when a destructive fire was poured into my ranks from the buildings and fortifications. Thompson, too, was stymied in his advance as he reached the outskirts of Pine Bluff, writing that, being in the rear of a row of large buildings, we could effect nothing more than keeping up a running fire from our sharpshooters. Monroe ordered Huey's battery forward to shell the Yankee positions, but wrote that, quote, my dismounted men were not engaged again during the day. So while Marmaduke's encirclement of Pine Bluff was complete, there would be no aggressive movement from his troops on the left. By mid-morning, a Union officer remembered, the cannonading and musket firing had become constant on all sides. All men were at work, the artillerymen at their guns, the cavalrymen with their carbines, the Negroes passing water to extinguish the fires in cotton breastworks as they caught from the recoil of the guns. But the Federals did begin taking casualties from the relentless fire of the Confederate sharpshooters and artillery. A soldier of the 5th Kansas reported that rebel artillery, quote, carried away a leg each of 2 men, another carried away a man's head, a third killed a man after glancing from a tree, and a fourth passed through the opening in the barricade, exploded in our midst, killing 3 and severely wounding several others. Well, August Bondy of the 5th Kansas was ordered to remove burning cotton bales lest they be used by the Rebs against them. Bondy wrote, the Reb Hotchkiss shells and bullets of small arms came among us like hail. I pulled my hat over my eyes, laid down my carbine, pulled my pistol, and cocking it, called on some 20 contrabands behind us to come up, which they did. Explained to them what was to be done and how, picked up some lariat ropes which happened handy, and organized 3 bands of them, and at the word forward, we fairly flew towards the bales and looked at the old barricades. 7 Negroes were shot down around me, 1 right by me, 3 dead, 4 died before the night. The balance with me at the barricade tied the ropes to 3 bales, respectively, and pulled them by main strength in 3 directions, the bales sheltering the pulling crews, set fire to them and all remaining bales, the smoke hiding us from sharpshooters more or less, and so without the loss of another man, I succeeded. That brought us to stage 2, which was an artillery attack. Colonel Colton Green ordered Samuel T. Ruffner's 3-gun Missouri battery to unlimber at the Methodist Church, and Daniel B. Griswold's light artillery battery to open fire from their left. Ruffner's guns soon, quote, played upon the courthouse and adjoining buildings with effect, while Griswold's battery drove the enemy's sharpshooters from their shelter. Yankee Horace Alice remembered that the Confederate cannons sent into solid shot and shell crashed through the courthouse and buildings in the range and into the open square among the corralled cavalry horses. Lieutenant Colonel Pace of the 1st Indiana reported that the rebel James and Hotchkiss shells slammed into the courthouse, quote, compelling our men to vacate at the double quick. And that is the Jefferson County Courthouse we see there. A.D. Brown of the 5th Kansas wrote that our men labored persistently to silence those guns, but to no purpose. To reach them, we were compelled to fire across the graveyard and through the church. The Kansan was scandalized that the Confederates would place their cannon at a house of worship on a Sunday morning, writing that, quote, such people would botanize their own mother's grave and canonize Judas Iscariot or C.L. Vallandigham. On the Confederate right, Pratt's battery had silenced such of them as were firing from the cupola of the courthouse and those in the Rogers storehouse, but the shot seemed not to do other very good, Colonel Newton reported. The Texans were ordered to limber up and join the rebel cannon at the more advantageous position by the Methodist Church. As Pratt left his position, Marmaduke's aide warned Major John Bull, whose Arkansans had been positioned in support of the Texas Cannoneers, that the Pine Bluff garrison was trying to flee across the river and escape the Confederate trap. Bull ordered his men to charge toward the river. As they raced across the street commanded by Clayton's troops, quote, the enemy opened on me with grape, and their sharpshooters poured a perfect shower of bullets into my ranks. Bull reported only one of his men was slightly wounded. As Bull's men reached the riverbank, they discovered not a fleeing garrison, but Pine Bluff's contraband men, forming a bucket brigade to pass water to douse the burning cotton barricades. Spotting the approaching Confederates, the black men abandoned their buckets, grabbed bales of cotton, and manhandled them into a breastwork to block any advances along the riverbank. 15 of the contraband were armed, and they quickly began blazing away at the Arkansas cavalrymen. Bull reported that his troops held their position for 40 minutes, quote, the enemy keeping up a severe fire, before pulling all his men, say 40 sharpshooters, to safer positions to the rear. Captain James Talbot, who commanded the contraband camps, praised the men on the riverbank for, quote, firing as many as 30 rounds. One actually ventured out and captured a prisoner. None of them had ever before seen a battle, and the facility with which they labored and the manly efforts put forth in holding the place excelled my highest expectations. That brings us to stage 3. With direct assault and massed artillery having failed, Marmaduke fired the town. An indignant A.D. Brown of Kansas wrote that the town was fired in several places at the same time, and their program began to develop itself. Failing to drive us from our position, they proposed to burn us out, even if they were compelled to sacrifice the whole town to their insatiable lust. Captain J. Reef of Thompson's Arkansas Brigade was among those who set the fire, and a Union officer wrote that Reef was pierced by 3 balls simultaneously, either of which was mortal. With his torch in his hand, he met his death, which continued burning until the hand that held it was blackened by smoke and fire. And Reef was not the only rebel who died in the flames, the officer continued, writing that several wounded Confederates had crawled into the quarters of the 5th Kansas, which were soon ablaze. They, quote, were unable to extricate themselves from the flames kindled by their friends. In an attempt to rescue them, in an attempt to rescue them by some of the 5th Kansas, they were fired upon and wounded and forced to leave them to their fate to be burned up by their friends. Clayton confirmed the deaths, accusing Marmaduke of a gross and barbarous deed, that several of his own men who were wounded were burned to death and almost entirely consumed by the flames he kindled. Clayton quickly ordered the contraband bucket brigade to begin carrying water and throwing it on the buildings immediately adjoining the square, and thus prevented the fire from doing me any real damage. This man, Sergeant Jacob D. Orcutt of Company A, 5th Kansas Cavalry, also fought the fire. A comrade wrote, amid the fire of rebel sharpshooters, he climbed upon the jail roof and drenched it with water, to prevent them from catching. He then made his way on top of a large 2.5-story house, and by his diligence he preserved that. To him we are indebted for the preservation of one whole side of the courthouse square. As the fire approached a building holding the regiment's mule herd, the Kansas opened the door to keep the mules from being burned. And A.D. Brown noted indignantly, we were obliged to cut them loose to prevent their burning up, and they slipped with the graybacks, much to our disgust. As the fires died down by mid-afternoon and the Union garrison still stood fast behind its cotton bale fortifications, Marmaduke faced a tough decision. Should he charge the courthouse square or call it a day? He wrote, the Federals could only be captured by storming their works, which would have cost me the loss of at least 500 men. I did not think it would pay. The rebel general ordered his men to disengage. The Confederates effected an orderly withdrawal, posing to nab everything they could carry from the camps of the 1st Indiana and the contrabands. What they could not take, they burned. Marmaduke claimed that much more would have been captured and brought off, but the order to prevent pillaging and straggling during the battle was strictly observed, and in withdrawing, the men did not have time to collect the valuables. Now, Horace Alice, a Yankee officer, reported widespread looting, claiming the rebels were feasting and frolicking among eatables and drinkables in the houses of those who had taken shelter under the river. Blankets, bedquilts, and every description of household comforts and necessities were gone. Not a horse, mule, bridle, or saddle remained outside the courthouse square to any citizen. While realizing the Confederates were retreating, Clayton ordered a pursuit. About a half mile from town, they were greeted with a volley from Colonel Lothar's rear guard, which was composed of Green's regiments and Young's battalion. A sharp firefight commenced for the next 15 minutes, after which the Kansans fell back. Regrouping, Scudder moved forward again, but after receiving a volley of fire from Solomon Kitchen's Missourians, he decided to break off and return to Pine Bluff. Clayton reported losing 11 soldiers killed, 27 wounded, and 1 missing, in addition to 5 contrabands who died in the fighting and 12 others who were injured. 62 of the mules who were cut loose to keep them from being burned alive were now Confederate property. And August Bondy wrote that 3 of the cavalry horses corralled around the courthouse, quote, some 100 of them ran off during the battle and were captured, as well as 60 Army wagons and their mule teams. Fire had consumed many of the buildings in town, including the quarters of the 5th Kansas, which held all the regiment's records and camp equipment. Captain Youngs wrote that, I lost on that day of the fight all my company books and records, all my private property, trunk, clothes, 1 gold watch, etc., etc. All the officers in our regiment, with a few exceptions, lost their baggage and clothing. We'd all considered, we were satisfied we got off as cheaply as we did. Pine Bluff itself was shattered. Arabella Wilson wrote that the whole town is utterly spoiled and that the Confederates had burned down the whole of Front Street. Clayton reported that the courthouse and several homes, quote, were nearly all destroyed by the enemy's artillery. There's scarcely a house in town that does not show the effects of the battle. A conclusion that was shared by a Wisconsin officer who arrived 2 weeks later and noted that the town shows the marks of a hard fight, many of the houses being riddled by shot. The Methodist Church had suffered for sheltering Marmaduke's artillery. Ohioan Robert McMahon observed that the floor was strewn with small, fine splinters, also with shot that had fallen on the inside, not having had the force to pass through only one wall. The old Bible, however, lay untouched, though one of the lamps near was knocked to atoms, and the end of the building behind the pulpit was perforated by 2 or 3 large shot. The triumphant Yankees reveled in their victory. A.D. Brown wrote that, our Eagles have again been victorious after a sanguinary struggle of 6 hours, and the haughty foe is in full retreat for the southern border, flatly whipped. Hal Clayton praised his troops in general orders issued on the 1st of November, writing that, you did it. To you belongs that reward, which is dearest to the heart of every true soldier, a nation's gratitude and praise. The men were supported by the men who supported the veterans of the 1st Indiana and 5th Kansas also garnered commendations. One soldier noted that the Home Guards or militia under Captain Murphy did well, though the Rebs got nearly all their horses, their quarters and stables being on the lower side of town. The Guard, after fighting a while as skirmishers on the east, gradually fell back with the rest behind the barricade. And of the contrabands, A.D. Brown observed that they worked patiently and with an unselfish devotion to our cause that goes far beyond the jaundiced prejudice of color. Many of them displayed a heroism under fire highly gratifying, and not a few were found behind their breastworks using the rifle. Marmaduke reported 101 casualties in his failed assault on Pine Bluff, 18 killed, including 2 officers, 67 wounded, and 16 missing. He tried to make the best of the situation, writing that we burned 1,000 bales of cotton, all their quartermaster and commissary stores, and some ordnance stores, brought away 300 Federal horses and mules, killed and scattered 200 more, captured and brought off 100 Negroes, destroyed the Negro camps, bringing off many tents, and scattered the Negroes. Confederate commander praised all the troops in the battle, writing that my troops behaved well, the Federals fought like devils. The effects of the battle. Theophilus Holmes, the former commander of the Confederate Arkansas, fretted in a letter to Marmaduke that your failure at Pine Bluff will make them feel perfectly secure there, and they may mass their cavalry at Benton for a raid on Washington. Texan Buck Walton observed that the result was that 800 men whipped at least 2,500 of as good men as we had. We took our defeat manfully and marched back to camp in Camden. A Missouri cavalryman concluded that The PB battle was a complete failure on our part. There was lots of grumbling among the men after the fight, who didn't think the thing was managed right. Our only thought was to capture the place, but we were doomed to failure after surprising them at that. The Confederate engineer Henry Merrill placed the blame squarely on Marmaduke's shoulders, writing that he summoned the town to surrender when he could have gone in without permission. Marmaduke's attack on Pine Bluff was doomed from the moment his central column was challenged by Lieutenant Clark's patrol on the Princeton Road. The loss of the element of surprise allowed a resourceful Union officer to create a practically invulnerable citadel manned by some of the toughest Yankee soldiers in Arkansas. The rebel general ultimately made the best choice available by calling off the attack instead of trying to take the town by frontal assault. As historian Ed Bars observed, considering that he had in the first place failed to capture the town by miscalculation on his part, he declined to retrieve the error he had made by sacrificing the blood of his men without any compensating advantages. And with the failed assault on Pine Bluff, 1863 concluded as a disastrous year for the Confederates, beginning with the loss of the post at the garrison at Arkansas Post, on to the tragic casualties suffered at Helena, and the loss of the capital at Little Rock and of Fort Smith in western Arkansas. So if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email at mchrist@cals.org. And thank you.